Welcome to another English Language A-Level video with me, Paul Heselton, Curriculum Leader for English Language here at the Queen Elizabeth Sixth Form College, Darlington. And in today's one, what we're going to do is we're going to think a little bit more about how to answer a meanings and representations, paper 1, section A, answer. Okay, so if you were in my class, I would be giving you a sheet of paper with a whole load of AO1 and AO3 key terms. And what I'll be getting you to do is these three things. So going through the list, ticking ones that you're pretty confident in defining and using, putting a little question mark next to ones that you probably recognise but might struggle to use in an exam, and then putting a cross next to a term which you're saying, nah. He's definitely never taught us that one. Okay, so if you've got that sheet, that would be your first move to do. Let's just have a look at some of these. So define and exemplify the following AO1 terms. So I've put 10 down here, which all I think are quite useful if you have a meanings and representations text in front of you, or indeed if you are doing your language investigation. Okay, so what I would do is I would pause the video there and I would go through each one of these. What does each term mean? And can you think of a good example of each? Okay, so I'm assuming that you've done that. Let's go through these. So euphemism, and by the way, the page numbers in brackets, they allude to the AQA textbook. There's good explanations about each of these. So euphemism is a piece of veiled language. Okay, so it's usually quite indirect language that's used to mask the horrible truth. So rather than saying, excuse me, can I go to the toilet? You might instead say, excuse me, can I just visit the bathroom? Or as my mother used to say, can I just powder my nose? That. So that's a euphemism, and different semantic fields will have different levels of euphemism. If we think of the world of business, for example, they're not going to tell you that they're sacking you. They're going to say, we're going to let you go, as if you were dying to leave in the first place. Or in the world of military, they're going to use terms like friendly fire or collateral damage. So different areas of life and different occupational areas are prone to using euphemistic language because they don't want people to think too much about the horrible truth of what they're actually saying. Okay, and a euphemism has an opposite, it's called the dysphemism. So a dysphemism is using very blunt, direct, often taboo language. So if you're looking at a transcript of a stand-up comedian, for example, they might use quite a lot of dysphemistic language in order to kind of shock and surprise and entertain you. Okay, next on the list, sound iconosity. Sound iconosity means that there is a relationship between the sound of the word or the group of words and their meanings. So this could be onomatopoeia, for example, like the water this morning when I cycled in was splashing down on the pavement. So that word splash, that material verb splash, has a certain level of sound iconosity because I can hear the water when I say the word. So it could be useful in a meanings and representations piece if you have a sort of carefully constructed written piece in which the writer has used sort of sound effects in the way that they've constructed language. The third one is negative face, which is explained in your textbook on page 48. Now, this is an element of pragmatics. This was introduced by a researcher called Goffman, who is a linguistic superhero. Goffman. And it's basically not what you think it might be, because when you see the word negative, you think, it means using negative language. And actually, it's the direct opposite of that. So if you use a negative linguistic strategy, it means that you're using language in a very indirect, ultra-polite way. Like, I wonder if you could possibly give in your homework on Friday, like that. Like no teacher ever said. So that's negative face. So what it does is it gives the receiver like options. They don't feel that they're like being pushed into a corner, and it's the ultimate form of politeness. So we usually use kind of mitigated language in order to achieve negative face. Now, the next one is schematic knowledge, which is easy because a schema is a bundle of knowledge about a subject. Okay, so when you look at texts on meanings and representations, there may well be big assumptions being made in texts about the reader's schematic knowledge. The next one is the passive voice, which is an aspect of grammar. Okay, so sentences can either be in the active or the passive voice. So active voice would be Paul smashed the window. And passive voice, what I'm doing is I'm taking the object of the sentence, which was window. I'm sticking it at the front of the sentence. And then I'm doing some jiggery-pokery with the verb form. So I'm taking a form of the verb to be, and then I'm taking the past participle form of the verb, and I'm saying the window was smashed. And I might just put by Paul at the end, or I might just leave it off. So the point about the passive voice is it kind of reduces the focus on the agent, in this case me smashing the window, and it puts more of the focus on the actual window being smashed. So it's perfect for things like government briefings, where you don't particularly want to draw attention to the fact that such and such a person or an institution is doing something. Okay, so it depersonalizes the language and it formalizes the language as well. And it's certainly something really good to point out in a meanings and representations text. Intertextuality is a word that's often confused by students because they use it in too general a way. Intertextuality means making an overt reference to another text. So if I said, to study English or not to study English, that is the question. That is an intertextual reference to Hamlet's famous soliloquy. It's a reference to another specific text. Okay, so look out for that in meanings and representations, because if there is intertextuality going on, there are cultural references and there are assumptions being made about the audience's schematic knowledge. Collocation's easy. A collocation is just an expected combination of words. Okay, like fish and chips, or once upon a time. And I suppose what's interesting about collocations is if you subvert them. Right. So the example I tend to use is of a charity advert for the NSPCC, where it had the headline, "Home is where the hurt is." Home is where the hurt is. Now that's a great example of a collocation that's been subverted. And so when you see that as a headline, you're intrigued because it's overturning your expectations. So collocations are expected groups of words. Next one is prosodic features. Prosodic features is the kind of musicality of your speech. So it's the variations that you do in terms of volume and pitch and intonation and those sorts of things. And they are massively important to point out. So in the exam, if you've got a transcript, like for example in the CLD exam, you've got a transcript of children talking, or in your meanings and representations, you could have a transcript. Or indeed, if you're writing about transcripts in your language investigation, it's very important to draw attention to the fact that the transcript is really only half the story, because you haven't really got a gauge of the prosodic features, and you actually can't see what's going on either, so you don't have the paralinguistic features. Right, the penultimate one is MLU, which is explained in the textbook under the CLD chapter. It means mean length utterance. So this is the average number of words that a person speaks per turn in a conversation. Okay, and this is quite useful if you've got two people speaking. Let's say, for example, you're looking at the presidential debate between Trump and Biden, and there's interaction going on between the two. You would want to count up the number of words that Trump uses, divide it by his utterances, and compare it with Biden, and then link it to the idea of power. Who is dominating or trying to dominate the conversation? So that's MLU. And then finally, we have deixis. So deixis means context-dependent speech. Now, this is the sort of thing that you're going to find in transcripts, but you might also find it in blended mode texts as well. Okay, so if I said, she put that there yesterday, she put that there yesterday is completely deictical. We don't know who she is, we don't know where that is, we don't know when yesterday was, unless you're actually there in the room. Now, there are different kinds of deixis, which are explained in your textbook on page 49. So she put that there yesterday. She there is personal deixis. So whenever we use a pronoun anaphorically, then that's a deictical reference. That's a personal piece of deixis. Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away, is a temporal piece of deixis, because it's to do with time. And what's the other one? Place as well. So that there, the there adverb there, that's a piece of spatial deixis. Okay, so you've got personal deixis, temporal deixis, spatial deixis, and even to make it more complicated, you've got the difference between this and that. So if something is far away from you, that is distal deixis, because it's in the distance. And if something is near to you, like this and these, that's called proximal deixis. Okay, so they're all explained there on page 49. Don't get too overwhelmed by all the terms that you can use. Clearly, the most important thing is to think how it links in with the meanings in that particular context. Right, move on. Representation. So the name of paper 1, section A, or at least the question, is about meanings and representations. So it's worthwhile just dwelling for a second upon that word. What does representation mean? It means that the portrayal of events, people and circumstances through language to create a way of seeing the world. And I suppose it's that last phrase there that's most interesting, right? So this text is not just going to be neutral, but it's trying to position your audience so that they think and feel in a certain kind of way, representation. So the re in representation is important because it highlights the fact that the presentation of something is often mediated through somebody else. And if you study media studies or media production, this is meat and drink to you. Okay, so it's mediated through somebody else. And so what you've got here is language, which is filtered through someone else's view of the world. Okay, so in language, you're sitting there in your paper 1, section A, and you might have a text that's from 100 years ago, and the text there is trying to make their audience, their implied readership at that time, think and feel in a certain way. It's a version of reality, okay? So think of all texts actually being quite subjective rather than objective. And therefore, if you want to put it in slightly pretentious terms, representation is therefore inherently ideological. Okay, so that's important because it's a key word and it'll get you the very highest marks if you keep using this word represent and representation in your answer. Okay, here are the bare bones of it then. English language paper 1, section 8, it's called Language and the Individual. It's an hour and a half. You're given 2 texts. The 2 texts are from 2 different modes. So we have 3 modes in English, don't we? We have written mode, we have spoken mode, and then we have blended mode texts. Okay, so you could be given, for example, a article from a newspaper, so that would be written mode, and then it could be put next to a couple of pages from a website. And that could be described as being blended mode because on the website it might have some quite big conversational features that are going on. On the other hand, you could get a transcript. They've done it in the past. There was an AS exam a couple of years ago, which was a transcript of a BBC Look North report about goths in Whitby. So, you could get a transcript put alongside a piece of written text. So 2 different modes. So they're expecting you to be commenting on the modal differences between the texts. The other difference between them, of course, is that one is current day and the other one is older. So when you're looking at the current day one, always think, right, this is a current day text. This could not have been produced 50 years ago. This could not have been written or spoken 100 years ago. So what is essentially current about it? So the currentness of the text might come through in the language, but the currentness of the text might also come through in the attitudes and the social values that are there. Okay, so the time factor on this is really interesting. And you have 3 tasks to do. So what you're doing is you're doing an analysis of one, an analysis of another, and then a comparison between the two. Now, your single analyses are assessed for these two things, AO1 and AO3. Now, AO1 is your key terms, so the sorts of things we were just talking about in the last slide, like deixis and collocation and those things. It also means linguistic methods, which means kind of picking apart the language levels and analysing language in a kind of objective way. And it's also about your written expression too. So that means SPUG, spelling, punctuation and grammar, but it also means using topic sentences so that you're shaping paragraphs so that they have a coherence. That's your AO1, so that's 10 out of the 25 marks. AO3 is meanings, representations and context. So it's really important on this that you use your contextual words like audience positioning, or implied and actual readership, or schematic knowledge, those sorts of words, and you link what you're seeing to actual meanings. And so you're getting the majority of the marks for analysing those things. Too often, students feature spot, which means if you just feature spot, you say, oh, well, over here we've got an imperative verb, and on the second sentence it looks like we've got a declarative. That in itself is pretty pointless. It might accrue you a few marks for AO1, but if you're not actually linking it to the meanings, i.e. the effects on the reader, then it's a bit of a waste of time. Okay, so the focus has to be in your answer on meanings and representations. And your task 3, which is your comparative one, it just has its own AO4, which is connections across texts. So the whole thing gets a mark out of 70, which is then doubled. And, there's a total actually for English language A-level of 500 marks. And this bit in itself is worth 140. Okay, so it's worth actually more than the entire total of your original writing and your CLD. Not your CLD, your original writing and your language investigation. So it's pretty important that you do it well. Okay, there's the question. Analyse how text A or text B uses language to create meanings and representations. Okay, so your answer needs to analyse, so it can't be just describing the features. So when you have a descriptive response, it basically deals with this question of what, so it points out what is there. Whereas an analytical response basically answers the question, well, how? So how has the language, how has the writer or speaker used language, and why have they done it in that way? Okay. Keep the focus on language features. You might have a text that's got all sorts of crazy graphological stuff going on, might have lots of colours and pictures and images and things like that, or variations in font size. Fine to write about that in media studies, but on English language, you just want to be focusing on the language. So don't turn it into a media studies essay, and don't also turn it into a sociology response. So the focus has to be on the language. Meanings. Notice the plurality of those two words. So meanings is plural. So what you need to do is you need to draw attention to how the language may be interpreted in multiple ways. So you've got different audiences that are looking at these texts, and they are perhaps reading these texts or listening to these words in a different context. Okay, so this is really, really important when you're looking at older texts, let's say from 100 or 150 years ago, because you can say, well, the implied readership at that time would have responded with a dominant hegemonic reading. They would have accepted the values of the text. But you can say a current day reader or listener might well respond in a very different way, with a kind of negotiated or even oppositional view, where they don't actually accept some of the values that are given. So the meanings are plural, and if you can draw attention to that, then that is the way to getting a really high mark on this. And finally, just the point that we made in the previous slide, really, or 2 slides ago, about representations. Representations are versions of reality. They're not reality, they are versions of reality, in the same way as that, your Facebook profile is a version of you, but it's not necessarily the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And so these versions of reality are used to position the audience's responses. So if you can pepper your answer with the word represent and representation frequently all the way through, then you are likely to do very well. Okay, right. Let's actually have a look, just quickly look at the mark scheme then. So on the AO1, I just want to draw attention to the fact that in order to get something like a C grade, you're having to do these things. So you're applying terms appropriately, you're labeling your features relevantly, and you are writing in clear topic sentences. Okay, so that's your kind of mid-range. If you're trying to access the very highest levels, which all of you should be doing, you should be trying to do this. So rather than just notice individual things that are going on in the text, like for example, in the second sentence, it's non-standard because there isn't a subject or a main verb. What you're trying to do is identify patterns that are going across the text, where you might be saying there is a very high level of non-standard features all the way through the text, and then give us examples from different places, and then connect that in with the context and the meanings. So the key word is to get the very highest mark is patterns. Patterns. And the other thing is you need to be guiding the reader, which means that in the short time that you've got, you've got to make sure that you're doing an organised response where you've got those topic sentences which are guiding the reader through your answer. That's your AO1. Your AO3 is this one. So to get your kind of average marks, you are interpreting the language choices that are going on and you are linking the language to context. Whereas on your top levels, it's this keyword evaluate. Okay, so you're analysing the things, but you're also weighing up the significance of individual words, which means that you've got to have a lot of practice in looking at text and deciding what are the 4 or 5 really key bits of this text that yield a lot of meaning. And the other thing to get the very highest mark is this one here, so wider social and cultural texts. So when you're looking at a current day text, what is it that makes this a current day text? And when you're looking at older text, how does that give us a window into society at the time, the way that people thought in those days? Okay, so let's just move on to an actual, looking at an actual example of one of these. What I'll do is, if I can, I'll get into this one, open it up, and let's have a look at it. Right, here we go. So this is an exam. This is like a specimen, one that the board sent us right at the beginning of the process. Here it is. So text A for question 1 and question 3. So if you're in my class, you would have the printout of the whole thing here. Notice what I said about it's very colourful. They like texts like this. They look like these blended mode texts where there's lots of colour and font sizes and font differences. But remember what I said, don't get dragged into talking too much about graphology, because really that's not to do with language features. So I will keep that, or what I'd say to you is, if you don't have the text in front of you, pause the video there, just look at the first half of this text, because there are 2 pages of it, and try and use your AO1 knowledge to annotate some of the key features and try and link it into what we've been saying about meanings and representations. Okay, right. So I'm assuming that you've done that. And so let's just go into the sort of pitfalls of things to avoid when you're actually writing your answer. Okay, so the first thing to avoid is this, writing a long, rambling and generic introduction. Lots of students do this because they think, well, I've got to do an intro paragraph, which is kind of setting the scene, and they end up writing this. Text B is from a forum on learner drivers on the Student Room website. The text has a range of interesting language features with various meanings and representations. Contextual factors play an important role in shaping the language choices by the participants. I will be exploring how the language links to the context in this essay. Now, that doesn't get you any marks at all. Even though it's quite well written and clear, there's nothing actually for me to credit. We know that this is a forum on on learner drivers, because it's been given to us, that information. It's clearly going to give us lots of interesting language features on means and representations, or else they wouldn't have given us to it. Context is going to play a part, and that's just basically saying, I'm going to answer the question. So whatever you do, don't 1, write out the question, and 2, do this kind of long, rambling and generic introduction. Instead, do what the man says. Get straight into the analysis. You don't need a warm-up intro paragraph. For example, first person singular pronouns, tick, AO1, and there's your examples, I, me, my, so they're patterns going across the text, dominate the text to fulfill the purpose. Here we're talking about AO3, so that's good. The purpose of representing, great, we're using the word representing, drivers' personal anecdotal experiences. Straight away in your first sentence, you're on the board. You're already climbing into level 3 with just that first sentence. I is the agent of the first 3 sentences by the Phelps, encouraging participants to respond with their own amusing first-hand experiences. So this seems to be a paragraph that's constructed around a grammatical idea of pronouns. And it's not just spotting the pronouns, it's trying to link it in with the context and the meanings. So that's the sort of thing that you need to be doing. Point number 2, things not to do in your answer. Don't just write about one language level. And lots of people, the weaker responses, tend to write just about lexis. The text uses a large number of informal words such as guys, massive, no idea. This shows that the participants are comfortable in expressing their views and are using language to entertain their readers. Well, there's some germs of truth in there, but you wouldn't necessarily have to be an A-level student in order to write an analysis like that. You could knock that out at GCSE level. So what you need instead is to be focusing on the language levels that you know so much about and integrating them together so that you produce something that's very, very concise and analytical. Like this, ellipsis, omission of subject and main verb in being stuck behind one. Notice I'm evidencing everything here. Capitalization, example very, and emojis to convey prosodic and paralinguistic features and humorous pre-modifying adjectives. There's an example, all combined to lower the level of formality to draw upon blended mode conversational features. Wow. Okay, so there's a range of different language levels that's being used, from grammar to graphology to phonology, again to lexis or grammar. So that's what I mean about using a range of different language levels in an integrated way. The third bit of advice I want to give you is don't just feature spot. So don't feature spot without linking to meanings and representations. For example, the thread begins with an imperative to share your worst learner driving experiences. The post by the Phelps starts with a declarative and follows this with an interrogative. In the second paragraph, an exclamative is used. Now that's getting some marks for AO1 because you're able to identify in a simplistic way what these sentence functions are. But it's not much use in itself and it's not very interesting because it's not linking to the meanings or the context. So instead, write something like this. A range of different sentence features helps represent the voices of the text as humorous and keen to interact. So there's your topic sentence. The direct imperative, share your worst learning driving experience, serves a request for interaction, implying that the site offers a community of listeners, in inverted commas, because they're not actually listening, who will not judge others' driving mistakes negatively. The interrogatives, and there's a couple of examples, establish adjacency exchanges to encourage reader participation. That's it. That's what's going to get us into our very top mark. Not that, but that. It's going to take a lot of practice to do it. I'm not saying that you're immediately going to be able to get into gear and do this straight away. You're going to need lots and lots of practice. But believe me, with practice, every time you'll get better and better at these things. Okay, so what I would do if I were you, if you're sitting in my class now, you'd have the text in front of you and you'd be having a go at doing this answer. Okay, and on the sheets that I give you also, once you've done that, I would be also showing you a student response and we'd be looking at that all together. But I think we've probably covered enough ground on that today. Thanks very much. And as I say, practice makes perfect. And just, through practice, you're just going to get better and better and better. Okay, thank you.